It's Monday, and that's what happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. Hello, and welcome to Monster Mondays. I am Jeff Arbuckle, co-host of the podcast Film Seizure, that you can catch each Wednesday at filmseizure.com or at a number of podcast providers online. It's time to move into the 80s and the wacky world of monster movies that happened therein. This week, we're going to look at an all-timer in the realm of early 80s non-slasher horror. And I could not think of a more appropriate director and auteur to select from, in terms of their filmography, than one Frank Henenlotter. Now, we need to discuss the sensitive tale of two brothers conjoined at birth but now separate and living very different existences in Henenlotter's directorial debut, Basket Case, from 1982. Now, Frank Henenlotter is kind of a fascinating character in the world of exploitation cinema. He was born in New York City in 1950, and he spent a lot of time watching movies and really getting into making his own films on 8mm. He told Fangoria magazine in a 1982 interview that it was Valley of the Zombies from 1946 that was the first movie that he ever remembered watching when it played on local television around 1958. He also mentioned remembering movies like The Wolfman on TV and then going to the theater as a kid to see the Vincent Price flick The Tingler. And later on, by his early adult years, he was a frequent visitor of the 42nd Street Grindhouse and other exploitation and sexploitation theaters. And that played a heavy influence on what he would ultimately make in his own horror films and various other interests. Now, his first ever movie was shot on 16mm film, and it was a short called The Slash of the Knife, and he finished it in 1972, and it was intended to be played as a double feature with John Waters' black comedy Pink Flamingos. However, that did not come to pass because the theater labeled Henenlotter's film to be too offensive to screen. Now, I have to echo Henenlotter's own sentiment from that same 1982 Fangoria interview. Can you possibly imagine a film too offensive to play alongside Pink Flamingos? I can't. I mean, any of those early John Waters films, I can't imagine. I almost have to see what The Slash of the Knife is all about, because if that was too much to play with Pink Flamingos, holy cow. So it would not be for another decade before Basket Case would get released and become Henenlotter's debut. Now, outside the Basket Case trilogy that ran from 1982 to 1991, Henenlotter's other two films are just as much the cult classic as this entry became. In 1988, he made Brain Damage, about a little wormy guy that takes control of somebody by injecting him with addictive goop. Then in 1990, he made the hilarious Frankenhooker, starring the lovely Patty Mullen. And he stepped away for a while before making a return in the 2000s with a pair of films, Bad Biology and Chasing Banksy, as well as a trio of documentaries, Herschel Gordon Lewis, The Godfather of Gore, That's Sexploitation, and Boiled Angels, The Trial of Mike Diana. But I think it's Basket Case that is really the movie that Henenlotter will forever be known for. It only did so-so with critics. I mean, its scant $35,000 budget likely made it easy to turn a profit, but it's really what's kind of come since, which is the cult classic status that it has now. And this is a popular film to play in revival screenings at theaters and drive-ins. It's a movie that isn't likely to be forgotten once you see it either. I mean, I love that Rex Reed, the massive bitch queen that he is when it comes to film review, sought out to see the movie after hearing all the negative reviews from his contemporaries. And when he saw it, someone asked him what he thought of it, to which he said, "This is the sickest movie ever made." And Reed didn't realize that the person who asked him that question about what he thought of it was, in fact, Frank Henenlotter, who then used that quote on promotional material, much to Reed's dismay, before he finally relented and allowed it to be used on posters and videotapes. Now, of course, the changing tides of how people react to horror films has taken place, and the new crop of reviewers have given it fairly favorable reviews. So let's get into this classic. We start outside the home of Dr. Julius Lifflander. He appears to be headed somewhere at night, but he hears something scurrying around the trees and bushes surrounding his country home in upstate New York. And he runs back inside, but whatever it was that chased him back in cuts his phone line and the power before attacking and slashing at his face, ultimately killing the doctor. Later, we meet Dwayne Bradley walking along 42nd Street in New York City, and he doesn't seem to respond to the pusher on the street trying to sell him some fun. He just kind of walks sort of listlessly and aimlessly, carrying a large wicker basket as he looks around and at his surroundings. He also has a pocket full of large bills, so he's got a lot of cash on him. But he finds a cruddy hotel to rent for a few days, and he goes out to get burgers to feed whatever it is that's in this large basket that he carries around, which happens to also have a voracious appetite. And whatever this thing is in the basket can communicate with Dwayne telepathically. Now, one of the regulars, a drunk named Brian, peeks into the keyhole to see basically if Dwayne's around so that he could eventually sneak in and steal his, giant stash of cash. But a hooker from down the hall named Casey strikes up a friendship with Dwayne to tell him he needs to be careful with his valuables in a place like this hotel. And he additionally befriends Sharon, an assistant to another doctor, Dr. Needleman, who he goes to visit with his basket. Now, Sharon volunteers to be a tour guide for Dwayne since he's new to New York City and he has no idea where anything is. Now, when Dwayne sees Dr. Needleman, he doesn't tell him who he is, but reveals a fairly nasty scar on the right side of his torso. And Dwayne whispers to Sharon about making plans to meet tomorrow so that, quote-unquote, he can't hear them. And while Dwayne takes his basket to a kung fu movie, Needleman nervously tries to call Lifflander, only because during his visit, Dwayne told him that Lifflander was dead, having been sheared in half. And he tries calling another doctor named Dr. Cutter, and she tells Needleman to just remember that they were never involved with anything that Lifflander did. They certainly never went to the small town that he was at in upstate New York, and that he needs to kind of not communicate with her anymore. Now, Dwayne returns to Needleman's office after Sharon leaves for the evening and dumps what's in his basket out to stalk and attack Needleman. But what is in this basket? Well, it's a little glob that is effectively a face, hands, and a whole lot of bumpy skin tissue. It's incredibly strong, it's always hungry, and it's absolutely murderous. And the thing's name is Belial. And this is Dwayne's brother. Now, you see, Dwayne and Belial were conjoined twins. Lifflander, Needleman, and Cutter separate the twins at a young age against their wishes. And this separation turned out to be neither of their liking. And it was done at the behest of their father, who pretty much despised Belial, but they end up, after they get separated and Dwayne discovers that Belial was to be basically thrown out with the trash, they murder their father, but no one could ever, they could never find any evidence that would put the twins at fault for that. But once their aunt, who very much cared for both of them, died, they were now on their own and they went looking for revenge by killing the doctors who separated them. And Belial resents being cut off of Dwayne, and Dwayne kind of resents how people view Belial. And he's kind of, he's emotionally tethered to this thing, and he really kind of can't live his own life without Belial, which means that he's kind of forced to basically be separated from the rest of humanity because of this thing. And he kind of despises that element of his life. Now, when Dwayne and Sharon meet to go sightseeing, they both admit to each other that they only offered and agreed to go sightseeing so they can be with one another. And when they kiss, Belial has a tantrum and wrecks the room, which draws attention to something funny going on with all the others who live in the hotel. And when the drunkard Brian finally gets into the room to steal Dwayne's money, Belial attacks him, which Dwayne senses telepathically, forcing him to cut his date with Sharon short. and he yells at Sharon to leave before, quote unquote, he can kill her too, but does not reveal that he has a secret murderous brother. But later, Dwayne runs into Casey at a bar, and they tie a few on, and they're just having a good old time. She asks him what's in the basket, and Dwayne drunkenly reveals that it's his brother, and he talks about how much of a freak his brother is and gives his backstory, and Casey gets a little bit freaked out. And after the lengthy flashback sequence that I described just a moment ago about the history of the brothers, Casey helps get Dwayne home and in bed to basically sleep off his stupor. And she peeks into the basket, but Belial is not there. Instead, he snuck into her room, scares her by revealing that he's in her bed when she goes to sleep, and then steals panties that she was wearing that night before escaping through the window and back into Dwayne's room. The next day, Dwayne takes Belial to see Dr. Cutter, who's revealed to actually be a vet. She wasn't even a human doctor, and she was the one who actually physically cut them apart. And she says that he must be there to thank her for making him, as she puts it, normal. And she opens the basket and is immediately attacked by Belial, and he kills her by basically shoving her head into a drawer full of scalpels, which when her nurses eventually get into the room to find her, all those scalpels are sticking out of her face. Yeah, it's pretty fun stuff. But when Dwayne returns to his apartment, Sharon is waiting for him and tells him that the police discovered Needleman's body and that she came to see him because Dwayne was the only person she was thinking about. And in his room, they begin kissing and making love, and naturally Belial pops out of his basket and he is pissed. So Dwayne has to basically throw Sharon out of the apartment to calm her down. And later, while Dwayne sleeps, Belial sneaks out of the room and goes to Sharon's apartment to rape her. But before leaving, he planted a dream in Dwayne's head where Dwayne's running naked to Sharon's apartment, where he finds her and makes love to her. But in reality, it's actually Belial that's doing this. And when she wakes up and finds Belial in her apartment on top of her, she begins screaming, which then leads to Belial killing her before Dwayne can come to her rescue. And he takes Belial home where they argue the whole way, which draws the attention of his neighbors at the hotel. And this also reveals Belial to his neighbors. And they fight to the point where Dwayne and Belial fall out of his third-story window and eventually, seemingly, land on the pavement, which would seemingly kill them while people begin gathering around them. Now, I say seemingly kill them because, of course, this is not the end, as Frank Henenlotter would return to the well for 2 sequels featuring Dwayne and his brother Belial. I think Basket Case 2 came out in 1990, and I think the third one came out in 1991. But let's talk about 3 things I like about Basket Case. And trust me, it won't be that hard to find 3 things. This movie is a lot of fun. And that's really my first like. This is the very definition of silly horror fun. It's not all that ludicrous of an idea, right? I mean, you got conjoined twins, one a normal looking guy, another a horribly deformed thing that was cut away from his brother. It's not even all that odd of an idea where the deformed twin is jealous of anyone getting into the normal looking twin's life and separating them even further. But this movie takes the idea to an almost comical level. Yes, there is horror here, but there are also a lot of little things that make you chuckle, like the guys who are always hanging out at the cruddy hotel. And, there's one guy who's, always complaining, and there's another guy who's always drunk off his ass. And the musical cues around various things, like one of the hookers that hangs out at the hotel, and it's got like that kind of sexy saxophone music sting or whatever. It's all cartoonish in how it plays out. So yeah, it's a horror movie, but it's also such a wild execution of a fairly straightforward concept of murderous conjoined twins. And it's almost like a parody that also is played straight while 100% not taking itself overly seriously. So it makes it such a really fun watch, if not total trash, which is exactly what it knows it is. Now, second, I love all the secondary characters. I mean, there is not a single character in this movie, aside from maybe Sharon, who isn't kind of a dirtbag. I mean, and I guess you could say Casey also is not really that much of a dirtbag. But still, even someone like Dr. Needleman is this sweaty guy who works in a decrepit office that, if that's where your doctor's office was, you might have to question some of your choices in life. But now maybe it's maybe it's a little harsh to call these characters dirtbags, but it is also another way that these are incredibly colorful characters littering this movie. I mean, everyone's kind of bombastic and over the top. The way they deliver their lines or the way that they physically act is kind of over the top, but they all exist in some level of dirt and bad choices that they've made in life. But because they're kind of, I guess eccentric is the right word, you just have a bunch of non-actors and amateurs just chewing all of the scenery of this movie. And I have a feeling that this is exactly what Frank Henenlotter wanted. And it's a very earnest kind of silliness to it. And with these characters in particular. But third, I have always liked Belial. Now, even before I ever saw this movie, this was something I was aware of thanks to my brothers. This is a movie about brothers, after all, so of course it was my brothers, the twins of the family, that knew about this movie before I did. But one of them even had a poster for this movie in his bedroom, so I was basically aware of what this movie was about before ever seeing it, and I had seen the creature inside the basket. My brothers told me about how it was about a guy who carried around his brother in that basket. So, but the look of this heap of tissue has always been a thing to appreciate in the movie. I mean, yes, he's gross, but he's also, yes, kind of funny. It's a funny little goblin guy, you know. He fits right into the over-the-top and almost cartoonish element of everything about this movie. It's goofy, but kind of scary and also a little gross. But I also like that it's most of the time a puppet, but other times he moves around with stop motion, or it's a guy wearing a monster hand glove and, so he can reach up and turn doorknobs and, well, I guess also grope women. But, it's a great little creature and definitely something you'll remember pretty much right away after you see it for the first time. You'll never forget that thing. But that wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. You can catch new episodes of Monster Mondays each Monday at FilmSeizure.com. But don't forget to follow Film Seizure at Facebook, Threads, Instagram, and Blue Sky. You can also subscribe to Film Seizure to get both the Film Seizure podcast and Monster Mondays at your favorite podcast providers, as well as YouTube. You can also check out my website, bmovieanima.com, to read new reviews every Friday morning. Next time, it's more kind of obscure 80s monster action as we talk about the directorial debut of an all-time great in the world of special effects. And that movie is Pumpkinhead. Until next week, stay spooky.